So, thank you for joining me today on my show. I really appreciate it.
Great to be here.
Yeah, it's always good to talk to you. Um, and I mean, there's a whole bunch of stuff I want to talk to you about. So hopefully this won't take too long, or but maybe it will. I, I mean, it's funny because I've been going through this process of changing my mind about COVID in a few different ways. And I know that you were one of the ones early on who's right away was criticizing the lockdown measures. Um, and I think that probably wasn't super well received early on. Is that
No,
correct?
not at all. Absolutely. No, very early on. I mean, I was criticizing the lockdown idea even before it came into force in the UK because we'd seen it in Italy and Spain. They had pretty severe lockdowns. And I remember thinking, there's no way that could ever happen in Britain. It's just not possible that Boris Johnson's government would lock down the country. And then lo and behold, we went into a lockdown. We were told it would be for 3 weeks. It ended up for being for almost 4 months. And we're still in lockdown in different parts of the country. We have a patchwork of lockdowns now, different tiers of lockdown across the country. It's psychotic in my view. But yeah, criticizing it early on was very difficult. And of course, people said that you wanted to kill old people. You didn't care about old people. You wanted the virus just to run rampant. And all those accusations were made against me and a few other people who criticized the idea of lockdown. It was a really weird, if you think back to March and April, it was a really weird time. I mean, the culture of fear was just absolutely staggering. People were living in a sense of dread. Certainly in Western Europe, there was a palpable sense of panic and dread and atomization and fear. And in that moment, people who raise questions about lockdown are not going to be received very well. But I think quite a few people in recent months have changed their mind or have become a bit more skeptical and are now open to the idea that shutting down the economy, shutting down public life, destroying hundreds of thousands of jobs is not necessarily the best way to approach a virus.
I mean, I I mean, early on, like you say, we were all sort of under the impression that this was a short term thing. So, personally, I was on board because I was like, whatever, 3, 4 weeks, who cares? We can handle it. Like, if this helps, let's just do it. Like,
Yeah.
I didn't realize and didn't really believe the people who were saying, oh no, this is going to go on through the fall, maybe even till next spring. Because I was like, that's ridiculous. Like, how could we possibly do that? That's crazy. And, here we are.
Well, that's the thing. I mean, I believed Boris Johnson when he said it would be for 3 weeks, and the aim of the lockdown in the UK, it had one simple aim, which was to prevent the National Health Service from being overwhelmed by COVID cases. So I could see the logic to that, and I had some days where I thought, okay, fine, let's just do this for 3 weeks, and other days where I thought, no, this is a bad precedent. But I could see the logic to it. But the logic just changed. It really dramatically changed. And suddenly it became about locking down until the virus goes away. And then there were even people talking about a zero COVID policy, which would be a policy where there would be zero cases of COVID and only then could we open up. And that's when I realized people had gone completely mad because you cannot crush a virus like that. That's not how it works. When a contagious virus is out and about, that's life. And of course, you can take precautionary measures, particularly to protect vulnerable groups and older people. And we should have done that. But the idea that you can crush it or hide away from it forever, that's why I think New Zealand under Jacinda Ardern has made such a terrible mistake because everyone is praising it as this great success story. But the reason New Zealand has so few cases and so few deaths is because it has completely cut itself off from the world. And every time it opens up, every time it lets in a few workers or a couple of immigrants or a few people returning home to New Zealand, it has an outbreak of cases. And at some point, New Zealand is going to have to accept that COVID will probably spread in New Zealand sometime in the future. It seems pretty inevitable to me. So when the policy became about preventing anyone from getting ill and almost having this zero COVID policy, that's when I knew that the political elites had really lost control of their brains and were pursuing a policy that was impossible and incredibly destructive.
Yeah, I mean, the same thing. That was the narrative in Canada also. So it was just to ensure that the hospitals weren't overwhelmed. We just got to get things under control. And then that happened. You know, the hospitals never did get overwhelmed in Canada. And, you know, certainly cases have been going up quite a bit in Canada. But no one's dying. You know, there's been a few deaths, and they're the very old in the care homes. And hospitals aren't being overwhelmed. So, yeah, I mean, at this point, it's like, okay, what's the game plan? And, there's a really big problem now because politicians are losing public trust because they told us one thing and now the narrative's changed and we're sort of like, okay, so what is it now? What are we doing? What are we waiting for? The vaccine? Like, the vaccine is not this magical cure-all anyway.
No, absolutely right. And I think there's a growing resentment and a growing disgruntlement with the whole lockdown policy. I can really feel that in the UK. I hear from friends overseas that there are similar situations in their countries. There's been actual protests and riots in parts of Italy because some Italians just cannot bear the idea of another lockdown. A lot of people are realizing how destructive lockdowns can be because, firstly, they completely strip us of our democratic rights and our civil liberties. I mean, Britain we have the most authoritarian laws we've ever had in peacetime. You can't gather in public, you can't have public protests unless you're Black Lives Matter, in which case you can do whatever you want. You can't meet people in different households in some parts of the country. In Wales currently has the most severe lockdown in Europe. And in Wales, they have closed all non-essential businesses, and the government has even told supermarkets to block off non-essential items like books, birthday cards, colouring books for children. So if you go into a supermarket in Wales, you can buy food, but you'll see that all the books are taped off and you're not allowed to go anywhere near them. And you just think, how have we got to a situation where governments are telling us what is essential in life and what is not essential? And what they're essentially saying is food and water is essential. You can get by on that, but you don't need books. You don't need the right to gather in public. You don't need the right to go to church. You don't need the right to visit your lover and have sex with them, because one of the rules in the UK during the lockdown was that lovers who lived separately were not allowed to visit each other. The most intimate form of authoritarianism has taken hold of some of our countries over the past 6 months. And alongside that complete collapse of civil liberties, of course, there's been the destruction of the economy. The UK is heading for the worst recession on record. Hundreds of thousands of people have lost their jobs. Numerous businesses have completely collapsed. Next year, the next 10 years are going to be incredibly difficult, especially for working class people and poor people. And this is all a result of the lockdown. And at some point, someone in a position of authority, either under pressure from the public or simply by coming to their senses, is going to have to realize that it's very possible that our cure for COVID will be more destructive than COVID itself in terms of the economic impact, the impact on liberty, and the impact on people's health and people's lives, because we know that when people get poorer, they get unhealthier, they can go into despair, and often life expectancy shrinks as a result. So we are storing up huge problems in the future by carrying out these crazy lockdowns.
Yeah, I mean, there's a bunch of different negative outcomes that can and are, coming to fruition as a result of the lockdowns. And I don't understand what the rationale is at this point. What would be the rationale for blocking off non-essential items? It seems torturous. People act like it's so frivolous. When I've been sort of complaining about these things a bit mostly in terms of, I mean, there's a lot of things that are silly, including the hyper sanitization, because we know that COVID spreads through droplets, and we're still doing this thing where every time you enter into any store or business or space, you have to dump a bunch of sanitizer on your hands, which is not good for anyone's health and not useful. Like, not necessary. Like, just wash your hands. That works. But you know, it's torturous to say you can't visit your partner unless you live together. It's torturous to keep people from hugging. It's torturous to keep people from meeting with their friends. People act like I'm being frivolous because I'm like, you know, going to the bar, people who don't like going to the bar are like, oh, so you can't go to the bar. But that's a major community building thing. Like, anybody who has had like a local pub where they go to and just everybody that they know is there, and that's, you know, for a lot of older single men, it seems to be very central to their socializing. It's always been central to my socializing. Like, there's certain places that you go and your friends are going to be there, you know, the bartenders, like, you know, people that live in your neighborhood. Like, it actually is a big deal. And then all these other things, church, you know, funerals, weddings, these things that bring us together, these traditions, you know, this is actually what's important in life. And I'm so confused and baffled as to how so many people have forgotten that and dismissed it as sort of not silly, or, you know, as silly, as unimportant, as unnecessary.
Yeah, I've been struck by the exact same thing. People talk about them as if they are luxuries that you can do without, but they're not. This is the stuff of life, you know, socializing, connecting, having relationships, having fun, feeling that you are part of a community. That is what makes life worth living, in fact. And what we've done in the lockdown is basically we've reduced people to the level of animals, essentially, especially in the early days of the lockdown, because we've said to them, listen, all you need is food and something to some water, maybe some milk if you're feeling luxurious, exercise once a day, and that's it. You'll be fine. Well, no, you won't be fine, actually. And the more that the lockdown has dragged on, the more that I have found lockdown fanatics will often say, oh, you can't go to the pub. Why are you making such a fuss about that? You can't go to the cinema. You can't go to a concert. What's the problem? Well, the problem is that those are the means through which human beings connect with each other and develop relationships and become happy. You know, this is the meaningful life, the good life. And I think what the lockdown has said is, look, you should be happy simply with the right to exist. But of course, lots of people want the right to live and to live in a meaningful way. One of the most tragic things in the UK, and I'm sure this is the case in other countries too, has been what has happened to older people. Firstly, because lots and lots of older people died from the virus because it impacts on them more harshly, and the care homes in the UK were not well looked after by the government at all. But also the isolation of older people has just been staggering. The pubs near me are just as you describe. Very often they are the focal point for older single gentlemen, you know, maybe widowers or just old blokes who don't really have much to do. So they go to the pub. Whenever I passed my local pub in the old days, I'd see them in there all the time. You know, men in their 60s and 70s, sat at a table with a newspaper and a pint of beer, very occasionally talking to someone else. And when the lockdown came in, I just thought, what happened to those men? You know, there must have been hundreds of thousands of them around the UK. What has happened to them? If their only outlet in their lives was going to the pub once a day and engaging with people, what are they doing now? And I'm sure many of them were just feeling in despair or completely atomized and completely lonely and dehumanized. The other thing is that, of course, there are lots of old, ill people in the UK who feel like their families have abandoned them, particularly people with senile dementia. And there have been some horrible stories here where families have been talking about they're not allowed to visit elderly people who are in homes because of the COVID rules. And these are people who are, you know, mentally unwell. They're in the certain stages of dementia, and they don't understand what's going on. So they think their families have abandoned them. And this is just absolutely devastating to those people. And the idea that it's impossible for us to come up with a way for families to continue visiting elderly relatives, that seems to me utterly bizarre. It's entirely feasible that we could come up with a safe way for that to happen. But instead, everyone is focusing on just locking down, shutting down, being super safe and super cautious. But there are dangers to safety. You can be too safe in the sense of protecting yourself from what's important in life and making some people feel so isolated that they literally feel like life isn't worth living.
Mm-hmm. And I mean, in Canada, in any case, there's been a really big focus on families and then nothing else. So, and it feels like the government, I mean, governments and politicians have always pandered to families. They like to just say the word families over and over and over and over again, hoping that will get them votes, and maybe that works. But, it's like, oh, well, families need this, families need this. And I mean, first of all, I don't think it's great for families to be isolated, I don't think it's healthy for it to just be like mom, dad, and the kids don't get to socialize, the kids don't get to school, like mom and dad don't get to socialize, go to work, see other people, get out of their bubble. But also, the entire world does not exist in a nuclear family. There's lots of single people, there's lots of older people, there's people who are in, different kinds of families who live separately, so on and so forth. And yeah, I mean, what do you think is the rationale behind all of this? Because I can't figure it out.
Yeah, I meant to come back to that point you raised about rationale, because I think you're right. People are increasingly mystified as to what the rationale is. I think in the early days, everyone understood. Some people will have agreed and some people will have disagreed, but the rationale was pretty clear. The argument was, in most Western countries, the argument was that our health system is not prepared for the number of cases that are likely to be caused by this virus, and therefore we're going to slow everything down, slow down the virus, and prepare ourselves and prepare the NHS or prepare the health service, etc. That made sense. People understood that. It was a logical thing. It was a short-term goal, and people were more than happy, most people were more than happy to go along with that and make a sacrifice. But the rationale just kept changing or just disappeared. And right now, I can't see any rationale whatsoever. The example of Wales, what's the rationale for refusing to allow parents to buy their children a colouring book? One young woman in Wales went into her local supermarket and was told that she couldn't buy tampons because tampons were not essential items. And then the government had to issue a statement, the Welsh government had to issue a statement making it clear that tampons, sanitary products, are actually essential items and you can buy them. And everyone, the women of Wales were like, well, thank you very much for giving us permission to buy sanitary products. You think, where's the rationale for any of this? It doesn't make sense. And in fact, I think it's worse than a lack of rationale. It's now become irrational. It's now become reckless and dangerous, and it seems there's no one in government with any foresight and the ability to think about the consequences of what they're doing. And I think what's really happened is that the culture of fear, I think over the past couple of decades, there's been a very palpable culture of fear, which has exploded around numerous issues. There was a culture of fear around the issue of terrorism for a while. I think my unpopular view is that a lot of the AIDS panic was driven by a culture of fear, a kind of sexual fear, the idea that sex was dangerous. I think the climate change issue is often driven by a politics of fear, even if there is a practical problem with climate change. I think the discussion about billions of people dying and the end of the world has been pretty hysterical. So there's been this culture of fear around for a while. And I think it's really exploded with COVID-19. And COVID-19 has folded itself into a narrative of fear. This idea that we're all super vulnerable, that you could die if you visit your grandmother could die if you have her over for Christmas dinner. Every other person is a danger. You've got to wear a mask. You've got to keep your distance. And I'm really interested in the way in which people now talk about the new normal. And the new normal is this idea that the post-COVID world will be a very fragmented one. It will be one where we won't go back to mosh pits and large sports gatherings for a long time. We'll all be wearing masks forever. We'll all be washing hands and keeping our distance. And it's almost like some people relish this idea that we will move into this kind of atomized dystopia. But I think there are a lot of other people out there who want to go back to the old normal. They want to go back to crowded trains and jumping up and down at a concert and getting drunk in a pub so crowded you can't even get to the bar. I think people really miss that. They miss that human connection, that human touch. And I think that's going to be one of the tensions going ahead, the tension between a public health outlook that wants to keep us all distanced and a human instinct to carry on with life in all its messiness and fun.
Mm-hmm. And, you know, I think that a lot of people have been sort of bullied into not saying, you know what, I actually really miss being in a really crowded bar and spitting in other people's faces.
Absolutely.
It was a really good time. You know, that's how you like connect with people, make friends, like meet partners. And, you know, kind of for me, at least, you know, like I work online a lot of the time. I was also doing, you know, events and talks and stuff. But for me, the reason that I could work online, I like that I can work online, but the reason that it was okay and not isolating and not overly stressful, overly anxiety inducing, just because of the nature of social media, was because I would be doing these events regularly, traveling regularly, and I'd be getting out and meeting people face to face, you know, hugging them, talking to them. You know, the events that I do can feel quite galvanizing. We all go out to the pub after, and it makes a massive difference in terms of reminding you what your purpose is. And, you know, the way that we interact with one another on social media is totally toxic, of course. And just going out with my friends, you know, things can get stressful. You're like, I've been inside for 5 days in a row on the computer, like leave, go out, go to the pub, be around normal people, check in with reality. And now there's not that, and people are acting like it's okay. Oh, we'll just transfer everything online. We'll do Halloween online this year. I mean, I don't care about Halloween personally, but I was like, is this a joke? You're going to have a Zoom Halloween party? Like, kill me.
It's like I've heard of people in the UK having Zoom nightclub, you know, where they stay in their own home and dance in front of the laptop while other people do the same in their homes. And it's just, I've seen clips of this on the news, and it's the saddest thing I've ever seen in my life. And I think I've had a similar experience to you, which is that I often do talks, travel around, do speeches in different parts of the world. All of that has come to a halt, of course. And there are two things that are really problematic with that. The first is I like traveling, so I really miss traveling around the world. That's one of my favorite things. But exactly as you describe, when you have these live events where you're talking at something or listening to someone else talk, those are the kinds of events where you make real connections with people and where you can change your mind and have proper forms of engagement and sometimes make long-lasting working relationships, personal relationships. That's incredibly essential to lots of people's working lives. When I do a speech online in front of Zoom, you know, what happens when you finish your speech? You close your computer down and you're in your living room on your own with a can of beer. I mean, it is not the same thing at all. And so that's one example of how the absence of social life, the absence of that kind of socialization dynamic can have a really detrimental impact on people's work, people's health, people's sense of purpose. And different people feel that, I think, in different ways. The question in my mind is how much of this is a response to COVID-19? How much of this authoritarianism is a response to COVID-19? And how much of it is something that had been brewing for a long time anyway? There's an interesting American writer called Sohrab Ahmari who he writes for the New York Post, and he makes the point that the political elites had been socially distancing from ordinary people for a long time. I've heard other people make the point that there's been the cult of the safe space over the past few years, where young people in particular want to inhabit a safe space and protect themselves from offensive ideas, from offensive people like Meghan Murphy, from anything that they consider to be toxic or dangerous. And so these ideas of safety and hiding away and putting yourself in a bubble and socially distancing and, safe sex, the ideology of safe sex, keep your distance, be wary, don't trust people. That culture has been growing for a long time. And I think what COVID has actually done has been to speed it up. And I think we are probably going to see the institutionalization of some of those really regressive, atomizing trends, unless there is a significant pushback and people start saying, listen, locking down society is not only not the right solution to COVID-19, but it is incredibly destructive of people's lives and of all the things that make human life worth living.
Mm-hmm. And I've been thinking about these new normal people too. I've been, trying to explore this idea of lockdown lovers, like people who seem really kind of into the lockdown and really, monitoring what other people are doing, monitoring the kind of conversations they're having about it. Like, obviously, we do this in all sorts of areas online. We love to polarize and create division and enemies and so on and so forth. So that same thing has been happening with COVID. But the people who tell me, oh, we're not going back to normal. This is the new normal. Everything's going to just be like this forever. And who seem kind of thrilled when they tell this to me. I'm just like, I don't understand. What is it that you're excited about?
Yeah, they freak me out. Those people really freak me out. We have them here too, lockdown fanatics. And during the early stages of the lockdown, we had this horrible situation in Britain where people were phoning the police to, grass on their neighbours, to snitch on their neighbours if they were going for more than one walk a day, or if they had a friend over. You weren't allowed to have friends over. There was a real culture of snitching and curtain twitching, as we call it here, where people were effectively spying on each other, which was so deeply unpleasant. But some people, not all people, some people were clearly getting a moral thrill from the lockdown and from their empowerment as essentially a citizen arm of the police, where they could spy on people and tell on people. And then the other thing that really worries me about these lockdown fanatics is how many of them are coming from the left. The left in the UK and also in the US, I think, has been incredibly favourable towards lockdown, has been very blinkered about its destructive economic consequences, don't seem to care about that at all, and have really cheered the lockdown, whereas it has largely fallen to people on the right to criticize it and to say, listen, this is not the right solution and it could be dangerous in the long term. So it's another issue also on which the left is just a source of constant disappointment, and they're not taking the principled stands that you might expect them to take. In the UK, the Labour Party, the left-wing Labour Party, and the kind of radical left-wing activists who hang around the Labour Party, they want another national lockdown. They want a lockdown across the entire country for 3 or 4 weeks. And when people say to them, listen, if you do that, thousands and thousands more people will lose their jobs. People will be plunged into poverty. People will be plunged into despair. They don't care because they've bought so much into the idea of safety and caution and never taking a risk, never exposing yourself to something that might be a little bit bad for you, whether it's a difficult idea or a novel virus. They've bought so much into the cult of safety that they don't care about anything else except being safe. And that, I think, is having a really bad impact on public discussion about the future.
Yeah, I've found that odd also, because it became pretty quickly a left versus right issue. So, people who are, in Canada, left-wing, progressive, and even, our Liberal Party, which is our centrist party, these people are all the kind of gung-ho about lockdown, the culture of fear people. It seems to be the same in the US where it's Republican versus Democrat. And I don't know why the left has taken up this position, which is so anti-society.
Yeah, I was thinking about that recently, and I think it's because of changes that have taken place on the left over the past few decades. And I think the most important change that has taken place, particularly in the social democratic left, so amongst Labour parties and social democracy parties, the biggest change has been that those parties have become increasingly distant from working class people, increasingly distant from ordinary people. Those parties across Europe, social democratic parties, have become colonized by the graduate classes, the kind of upper middle classes, the woke elites, people who are more interested in things like trans rights or Black Lives Matter rather than in economic questions about pay and conditions and how working class people live. So there's been a palpable shift on the left away from democracy to technocracy and away from fighting alongside working class people to viewing working class people as this kind of problematic throng who need to be managed and looked after, and we need the nanny state and we need other forces to make sure that they're not too obese, that they're not too stupid, that they believe the right things, that they hold the correct thoughts. I mean, those views have been growing on the left for quite a long time, and I think that's why we've got to a situation where when this virus hit our countries, their first instinct was to say, well, let's use the almighty power of the state to control people's every move. Precisely because they had become so distant from their origins of trusting people and believing that democracy and public debate were good things. So the left has changed in terrible ways, in my view, over the past 3 or 4 decades. And I think their lockdown fanaticism shows just how far they've gone. They've gone from being parties that sought to represent the interests of working people to being parties that are so distant and disdainful of ordinary people that they think nothing of calling on the state essentially to put ordinary people under house arrest for 3 months. I think that the lockdown fanaticism of the left tells us a really important story about the decline of the left over the past 3 decades.
Yeah, I think you're right, because it seems to me that the left has become so elitist and so condescending. And that's why we're seeing, ironically, the Republican Party and Trump is supported by the people who are supposed to be supported by the left, right? The plebes, the working class people, and the regular, ordinary working people. And the left has decided that these people are too stupid to participate in the left, right, and are completely condescending, completely insulting to them, write them all off as a bunch of like idiot, crazy, racist, conspiracy theorists. And it's like, good, you just pushed a whole bunch of people to vote for Trump because at least he's treating them with respect and listening to them and speaking to them, whether or not he's sincere in that. He is. I don't know if you probably watched the debate. The first debate was terrible. The second debate, Trump did a lot better, and I was like, he's telling people what they want to hear. Like, are you guys paying attention over there on the left?
Yeah, I completely agree. I think elitist and condescending are 2 perfect words to describe the contemporary left. And in the UK, we had an even more graphic example of what you're talking about, because at the general election in December 2019, Boris Johnson's Conservative Party won an unprecedented victory, a huge democratic mandate. And a lot of that came from parts of the country that had voted Labour for 100 years. The so-called Red Wall. The Red Wall is this huge swathe of the United Kingdom that had always voted Labour, and most of the Red Wall fell to the Conservative Party. And it makes perfect sense to me. It's because the left and the Labour Party had come to view working class people as a problem, not as the solution to the world's ills, but as the cause of the world's ills. They're racist, they read the wrong newspapers, they're brainwashed by the Daily Mail or the Sun. Of course, they're all racist. They all hate immigrants. They're all regressive and backward and not very eco-friendly. I mean, they've been pushing these views of ordinary people for a long time. And the only question in my mind is why did it take working class people so long before they revolted against these condescending elites? But I think that's what's happened to the left. The left has now become, left-wing politics has become the plaything of fairly posh people, fairly upper-class people, very over-educated people in a sense, who use the left to try and push, or use left-wing institutions and parties to try and push their eccentric woke ideology onto society at large. I think Donald Trump, in my mind, is the most fascinating political phenomenon of our times, because the way I see Trump, the reason I've always found the response to Trump more scary than Trump himself. And I say that as someone who is not particularly a fan of Trump, but the response to Trump over the past 4 years from elite institutions and the left and the media has been absolutely deranged, absolutely hysterical. They talk about him as the new Hitler, as the person who's going to turn America into a fascist republic, a fascist nation, the most evil politician America has ever seen. It's been completely out of proportion to what he actually is, which is, a bit of a bumbling fool, and he's got some bad opinions and some okay opinions. And I think the reason they had that response is because they recognized at some level that Trump had exposed the elitism of the new political classes, and he was speaking directly to ordinary people. He doesn't even bother with the media, because the media mostly hates him, and he speaks directly to ordinary people in a language they understand. He criticizes cancel culture. He criticizes the 1619 Project at the New York Times, which says that America was founded on slavery rather than in the fight for an independent republic. He criticizes the excesses of woke politics, and he criticizes the Hollywood elites and the East Coast elites. And lots of Americans agree with him. And I think the reason there is so much visceral hatred for Donald Trump from the cultural elites in particular is because they recognize that he's tapping into a groundswell of resentment against these new leftish elites, and a sense amongst ordinary people that they would like politics to become a bit more reasonable.
Right. And it's interesting because I've seen a lot of people say that Trump attacks democracy, but I mean, the left has been completely guilty of that themselves, as evidenced by all this COVID stuff in a number of other ways also. But it's like, oh, we can't trust these dummies to participate in politics. We have to tell them what they think, and if they think wrong, we have to cancel them. Like, democracy is a danger. This is essentially what they're saying. Like,
Absolutely.
And we see it in the way that they respond to these protests, Oh, Black Lives Matter, that's fine. We support that. It's an important protest. And they use hyperbole to defend it. Like, if we don't have these protests, people are going to get murdered all over the place, and white supremacists will take over the country. Like the Proud Boys are some national threat. Like the Proud Boys. I'm just like, okay, come on. But, and then when they're talking about the anti-lockdown protests, it's like, this is dangerous. What are these dummies doing? They're out here like killing grandmas.
Yeah.
The
double standards are just absolutely extraordinary and so explicit. I mean, you had those public health officials in America who wrote a letter saying, we support the right of people to take part in Black Lives Matter protests. And in that letter it says, but this doesn't mean we support the right of people to protest against lockdown, because that would be dangerous. I mean, just open, explicit partisan hypocrisy. But on the democracy question, I've often argued that it's the anti-Trump lobby that is genuinely anti-democratic, or certainly more anti-democratic than Trump ever could be. Because what we've seen in the US and the UK over the past 4 years is something genuinely staggering, which far too few people talk about, in my view, which has been open, explicit attempts by sections of the establishment to override a democratic vote. So in the UK, there was a 3-year war by sections of the establishment to prevent Brexit from happening, something that was voted for by 17.4 million people. And they tried to prevent it from happening on the basis that these people didn't know what they were voting for. They were hoodwinked by the tabloid media or by memes on Facebook or by Russian bots. Basically, they're a bunch of stupid idiots who were brainwashed by powerful forces. And then, of course, in America, we had the obsession with Russia, which was pushed by all these kind of liberal media types who said that Trump was essentially put into the White House by Putin and was a Russian stooge, and Russia is the reason he won the election, which again is based on the idea that ordinary people don't really have much agency. They were led astray by Russian bots or Russian propaganda, and that's why they voted in the way that they did. And those two things were openly anti-democratic campaigns. And the thing that really pissed me off about the fact that the left was involved in that, is because if the left isn't about democracy, what is it about? The left was founded 250 years ago or 200 years ago, whenever it was, precisely to give voice to people who had been excluded from politics, precisely to provide a space in politics for working people and poor people to have their interests represented and taken seriously. So the left was founded as a democratic movement, precisely to throw open politics to the demos, to ordinary people. Now that the left is turning its back on that and has become explicitly anti-democratic and wants to overturn problematic votes, cancel problematic people, and silence public discussion, that, to my mind, is just a colossal betrayal of what the left was founded to do.
Mm-hmm, for sure. I mean, and I suspect, getting back to COVID a little bit, that, some people watching might think that, we're not taking the danger seriously in terms of this global pandemic. I mean, do you think there is a danger, or, is this kind of just like the flu, like any other virus, or, just like any other kind of danger facing humans that we just have to live with, and, some people are going to die, which of course sounds like you're brushing off something very serious, because of course we don't want people to die. That's terrible. I don't want to get sick. I don't want to get COVID, but, for all I know, I already had it. I'm sure lots of people suspect they had it already, but I was quite sick back in March when I got back from traveling, and they wouldn't test me because I guess they just didn't have the capability to be testing people who weren't coming directly back from like Wuhan. But I was like, pretty sure I have all the symptoms. And they were like, sorry, you'll never know. But anyway, yeah, like, do you think that we're being kind of like glib about this and not talking about the danger? Or
I think I try not to be glib. I mean, it is worse than flu. All the evidence points in that direction. The death rate for COVID-19 is far higher than the death rate for flu. COVID-19 is particularly bad for older people and people with certain underlying conditions. So all of that is true, and all of that is real, and it's a genuine health challenge. That's the way I see COVID-19. It's a real challenge to Western societies, all societies, obviously, that it impacts on, and measures should be taken to ensure that its impact is not as bad as it might be. So I agree with all of that. I had COVID-19. I had the test. I've even been donating plasma to the NHS, because if you've had COVID-19, it's quite good to donate plasma. And it was pretty rough, for a couple of weeks. No taste, no smell, extreme fatigue, high fever, the most surreal headaches of my life. I mean, all of this stuff, it definitely is not like flu, but that, in my case, that might be because it was so novel. It was a kind of sickness I'd not had before, but it did last just about a week or two for me, and then it went away. So it's manageable. And for the vast majority of people, it is manageable. You don't need any treatment. You just need to go to bed and drink water. So this is a manageable virus for most people. For those people who are more vulnerable to it, I think we need to take precautions. I think they should be voluntary precautions. I don't think we should lock old people away. But what we could say to older people is, look, these are the risks. This is the support society will give you if you want to lock away. but it's your choice. And I think that's how we should approach that problem. But what we had in the UK, and I think this is the case in other countries too, we had the worst of both worlds, which is that we locked down healthy people. So we locked down the whole of society and prevented people from going to work, which really screwed up our economy. And we failed to lock down older, vulnerable people. So we didn't lock down care homes. And in fact, we allowed infected older people to go back into care homes. So lockdown fanaticism is actually quite dangerous because governments become so obsessed with minutely locking down every part of society and obsessing over, the person who goes for 2 walks a day, or the young kids who have a party of 8 people in their house instead of just 6 people. They're so obsessed with policing the minutiae of how people live that they lose sight of the specific needs when COVID-19 comes around, which is protect older people, protect vulnerable people, provide them with the resources so that they can stay away from society if they want to, and get food and medicine and assistance and visits and so on. Instead of doing those specific things that would have been incredibly useful, the lockdown fanatics encourage this broader, sweeping culture of fear. So I actually think lockdown fanaticism has a lot to answer for, because a society that can't be focused in how it tackles the virus is going to be a society that fails on all fronts. It will fail to tackle the virus when it hits older people, and it will fail to protect the economy and normal public life.
And do you think there should be any restrictions at all? Do you think that we should be continuing to social distance? We should be continuing to, not have large events, have travel restrictions, things like that?
I think I think a voluntary system is always preferable. The thing is, if you look at Sweden, for example, I know anyone who talks about Sweden now is apparently a far-right lunatic. That's the way in which the pro-Sweden people are understood. But the myth about Sweden is that it just allowed life to go on as normal. That's actually not true. There were certain regulations. Public events, for example, were reduced in number, so you couldn't have a gathering of 5,000 people, but you could possibly have a gathering of 100 people or 50 people. But alongside those regulations, there were also voluntary measures. So people were encouraged to socially distance. People were encouraged to work from home if they could. People were encouraged to use public transport less. And many people took those options and decided for a short period of time that they would do these things. But it was voluntary. People weren't fined. People weren't forced. The police wouldn't go into a bar and tell you to get out. And I think that would have been a far preferable option. And Britain was going down that road to begin with before Boris Johnson lost his nerve. And if you look at the statistics for Britain just before the lockdown was enforced, people were already limiting their everyday behavior. So people were already using the tube and buses less than they had before. More people had started working from home. Pubs were being visited less frequently. So people actually were taking voluntary measures for a short period of time to see if they could help with the virus. When you then bring in a lockdown and remove all element of choice and make it this authoritarian initiative, I think that just makes things a million times worse. So I'm open to the suggestion that we need temporary regulations in some areas of life. So, for example, maybe we can't yet go back to having 20,000 people watching Nick Cave at Wembley Arena. But I think the obsessive policing of every form of human engagement, which we've seen over the past 6 months, is completely unnecessary, completely self-defeating, does nothing to help the virus, but does have a very bad impact on people's mental health, emotional health, social health, and on their ability to make a living. So some regulations, yes, but the kind of regulations we've had over the past 6 months, absolutely not.
Mm-hmm. And where do you think that people should go about pushing back? Are we talking about votes? Are we talking about lobbying politicians? Are we talking about just ignoring restrictions, protest, whatever? Like, what should people be doing to ensure this kind of doesn't go too far and that it doesn't stick?
Well, I think there's I think two things are going on. I think lots of people are ignoring the rules now or finding a way around them. So in the UK, for example, about 90% of people who are told to quarantine. So people are now being told to quarantine if they have a positive result or if they know someone who's had a positive result. And I think more than 1 million people are currently under quarantine in some form or another. 90% of those people are not quarantining. And 90% of people admit to having broken quarantine. So they've gone outside, they've gone to the shops, they've visited friends. So people are breaking the rules. It's not working. And some people are breaking the rules because they can't afford to quarantine. They have to work. They're low earners. Other people are breaking the rules just because they want to visit their lover and have a nice evening. Some people are breaking the rules just because, they did it for 5 or 6 days and now they're feeling a bit depressed. So people are making, I think, rational decisions to bend the rules or break the rules in order to live a meaningful life. I don't think that means they're being destructive. I'm sure many people are taking precautions, and that's fine as far as I'm concerned. So that's already happening, I think, and that's probably happening in most countries. People are getting around the rules in some fashion. But I do think we need a bigger political pushback, and I do think we need protests. We need to vote in a particular way that prevents these kinds of politicians from ever doing this again. The problem, of course, is that if you protest against lockdown, you will be demonized as a lunatic and a conspiracy theorist and someone who wants to kill old people. In the UK, the protests we've seen against lockdown have been severely attacked by the police. The organisers have been fined a huge amount of money for organising illegal gatherings, whereas Black Lives Matter protesters were treated with kid gloves. There weren't many fines, and in fact some police officers actually took the knee in front of the protesters to show their support for Black Lives Matter. So we do need protests, we do need pushback, but that's going to be difficult because the climate is so hysterical now that people are scared to protest and scared to speak up.
Mm-hmm. I wanted to switch over a little bit to another topic, which, is actually still very much connected to the problem with the left these days, the problem with political polarization, the problem with media bias and virtue signaling and so on and so forth. And, it's the recent murder of Samuel Paty in France, and you wrote about that, and I didn't really see much coverage of it at all in North America, so I didn't see anybody really talking about it on my social media feeds, and part of that probably is just that, it happened in France, so it's sort of far away. I know there's been a lot of media coverage in France around it. There's been a lot of protests, politicians have been speaking out and so on and so forth, but I do wonder if the circumstances had been different of that murder, who would have been speaking out here in North America. First, I suppose, we should explain for anyone who's not aware. You probably know much more about what happened. As I understand it, Samuel Paty was a school teacher in France, and he was pretty brutally murdered for showing Charlie Hebdo cartoons in his classroom. Is that accurate?
Yeah, that's right. So he had held a classroom discussion about freedom of speech, and as part of this discussion, he showed the Charlie Hebdo cartoons of Muhammad to his school kids. And he offered his Muslim pupils the chance to leave the classroom so that they wouldn't be offended, and many of them did, but a couple of them didn't leave, and they saw the cartoons. And it caused this huge fuss in the area of Paris that he comes from, and there were, an imam denounced him, and there was a fuss on social media, and one of the parents of one of the kids at the school denounced him in a social media post. So there was a small local fuss. But then it was picked up by this lunatic who went to the school, asked the kids to point out Samuel Paty, and then decapitated him in the streets. It just absolutely barbaric. It boggles the mind, completely medieval. And I'm really shocked by the lack of coverage. particularly in the UK. France is our next door neighbour. It's 25 miles away from us. It's an ally. France and Britain are basically the world's most famous frenemies. You know, sometimes we're friends, sometimes we're enemies. We have huge connections with France, and the coverage here and the discussion here has been completely lacking, particularly from the left and particularly from the so-called anti-fascists who, you know, when a fascist decapitated a school teacher, had nothing to say. And that's how I view these radical Islamists. I think it is a species of fascism. It's incredibly regressive. It has far-right tendencies. It's intolerant. It's misogynistic. It's homophobic. And it's anti-Semitic. You know, this is a fascistic form of violence. And the lack of discussion I found deeply disturbing. And I think it's because people are uncomfortable talking about the problem of radical Islam, even though in France, 250 people have been killed by radical Islamists over the past 5 years. In the UK, there have been 3 huge radical Islamist attacks over the past 3 or 4 years, including the one at the Manchester Arena, which killed mostly girls who were going to an Ariana Grande concert. And all of this stuff disappears from the public consciousness pretty fast because people are unwilling to talk about it. The way I see the beheading of Samuel Paty, I think it was an extremist Islamist form of cancel culture. And I'm not saying that to be facetious. I think these kind of acts don't take place in a vacuum. They take place in an era in which people think they have a right not to be offended, in which people think they have a right to cancel those who offend them, in which we're constantly told that any criticism of Islam is Islamophobia, any criticism of the politics of transgenderism is transphobia, any Christian who believes that marriage is for men and women that's homophobia. There's these constant attempts to demonize people who hold certain moral or political views and to try and cancel them and ban them and expel them from polite society. And I think the beheading of Samuel Paty and the massacre at Charlie Hebdo in 2015, these were essentially the armed wing of political correctness. This was the militant wing of cancel culture. And that's why I think it is so incredibly important that people in Western Europe and the US and around the world stand up for freedom of speech and insist that, you know, no one has the right not to be offended. You don't have the right not to be offended, and you don't have the right to cancel or attack someone who holds a different opinion to yours.
Exactly. I mean, you're right. It is framed in many ways, in similar ways to the leftists who say that, you know, criticizing trans activism, criticizing Black Lives Matter, criticizing critical race theory, criticizing all this language and these policies around inclusion and diversity. There's all sorts of issues that you can't really talk about or criticize or disagree with. And if you do, you'll be accused of being so bad that you are deserving of violence. And it's not played out in the extreme ways that it has in terms of like Islamic extremism. I don't want to compare threats of violence to a literal beheading, but these things are defended by the left. They really are. You know, it's not hyperbolic to say that if you take a wrong political position, you are accused of being a fascist and a Nazi and so dangerous to a minority group, so dangerous to society that actually it's fine to be violent against, you know, it's fine to be violent against cops because cops are all bastards, according to the left. And I mean, and it's also notable that the left really has failed to speak out about this form of violence. It's interesting to know that there wasn't much coverage in the UK because I just thought, oh, maybe I'm just not seeing anybody talking about this because most of my feeds are full of Americans and Canadians. But I also do have a lot of UK people in my feeds, many of whom were hysterical about Black Lives Matter. And about supporting Black Lives Matter and about framing anybody who was critical of Black Lives Matter and what they were doing and advocating and how those protests were playing out and the rioting and the violence as right-wingers and as racist. And this is coming from a group of people who have no connection really to the politics of Black Lives Matter, which is really an American politic and about the history of race and racism in America. And these people apparently have nothing to say about this violence that's happening in the UK.
It's crazy. And I think it's, you know, I would make a bit of a link actually between that broader culture of intolerance and the rise of this kind of violence, because the point I would make is that you know, these things differ by degree, they differ by severity. In the UK, and I'm sure it's true of other Western European countries too, you can be cancelled for criticizing Islam. A man was sacked from his job for sharing a joke about Islam on his Facebook page. In some European countries, people have been taken to court for insulting Muhammad or for mocking Islam, and you know, that's referred to as religious hatred. So that differs by degree, of course, from shooting someone or beheading someone for criticizing Islam, but they're in the same ballpark, and they're in the ballpark of saying that there are some things you shouldn't say, and if you do say them, you can be punished. You know, us polite, decent, lefty people will punish you by organizing a petition against you or getting you sacked or maybe having you taken to court for offending people, whereas the Islamist extremists will go much further than that. But there's a similarity, that they're both in the same ballpark of intolerance. And the problem is that we live in a climate in which we're constantly told that words are violence. And words hurt and words wound, and if you express the wrong opinion, you will erase people and you'll wound people and you will compromise their safety. And of course, if you see words as violence, then violence becomes a legitimate response to words, because sometimes you have to fight violence with violence. And the more we tell people that words and images are like a psychic form of violence that will destroy their self-esteem and make them feel unsafe and make them feel erased, the more we will see violence as a, you know, logical response to words. And at the moment, that's coming from Islamic extremists who clearly feel offended by these cartoons and clearly feel they have the right to cancel the people who offended them. But I wouldn't be surprised if we started to see more violence in intolerant lefty circles as well, where people could well be physically attacked. You know, if you look at TERFs, for example, kill TERFs is a relatively common phrase online. J.K. Rowling is subjected to death threats and rape threats and misogynistic abuse all the time. So it is getting more intense. And I think we've got to start understanding freedom of speech as the most important freedom. Otherwise, we're going to be in serious trouble.
I mean, an event that we had planned here in Vancouver last year, I'm trying to remember when it was scheduled to take place. Maybe November. It was originally scheduled to take place at a university, my university actually, like my alma mater, and was canceled at the very last minute because a man had threatened such violence that security felt they couldn't ensure that they could keep people safe. You know, they were worried that something so bad would happen and then it would be on them for having let this event go forward. So we found a different space at the last minute and did the event somewhere else. And it was what's notable about those kinds of threats and that form of cancel culture, which has really taken hold in the West, well, actually probably in lots of other places in different forms, is that the left doesn't speak out against it. And, you know, in many ways, you know, this man who threatened so much violence that we had to cancel our event still sort of works with local leftist groups, some of which are legitimate. And, you know, they're probably scared of him too, but like, this is something that they are participating in essentially by vilifying women who speak out about gender identity ideology. And yeah, I mean, there are similarities, and it's very strange to me that leftists don't see the problem in that And that leftists don't see that this also makes them vulnerable, that they somehow think that they're protected from this culture.
Well, that's the real stupidity of anyone who supports censorship, which is that it will always come back to bite you on the arse. I mean, as soon as you greenlight the logic of censorship, then you dig your own grave in a sense, because you make it acceptable to silence people who apparently have the incorrect views. And the wind could change. You know, today it's trans skeptical feminists or anti-woke people or people who criticize critical race theory. They might be the people getting cancelled today, but you know, next month or next year or in 10 years time, it might be Marxist, it might be Antifa, it might be any kind of group. So it's always wrong to support censorship. I think Noam Chomsky got this right. He said that if you're in favor of freedom of speech, then you're in favor of freedom of speech precisely for views you disagree with. And he made the point that Goebbels and Stalin supported freedom of speech for views they agree with. Everyone supports freedom of speech for views they agree with. The real test is supporting freedom of speech for views you disagree with. And the left fails that test all the time these days. But I think the culture of intolerance that the left has helped to stir up, I see it as a profound threat to society, because it's making people self-censor. It's making everything dumbed down because we don't have the intellectual free discussions we ought to have. It's given rise to dogma and these dogmatic beliefs that everyone feels they have to conform to because you're not allowed to criticize them. And it's given rise to tension and sometimes even violence. I mean, I've had people protesting against me when I speak on campuses, and, you know, it can get a bit hairy sometimes. People get really het up and really angry. And I know that you've had similar, well, far worse experiences. So I do think the identitarian politics and the censorious politics and the supposedly woke politics of the left is getting out of control. And it's going in unpredictable directions. And the thing that really brought that home to me was that footage of Black Lives Matter protesters in Washington, D.C., who were screaming in the faces of people who were just eating their food on the sidewalk or in a restaurant, and demanding that they raise their fists and demanding that they swear loyalty to Black Lives Matter. What we're witnessing is the explosion of crazy campus politics into public life, onto the streets. And I think that could become really problematic and even quite dangerous.
Mm-hmm. Would you say that there is a rise in Islamic extremism in Europe right now?
Definitely. Over the past few years, it might be tapering off a little bit because of the defeat of ISIS in Syria and Iraq. And ISIS was the source of inspiration for lots of these lunatics. But yeah, definitely over the past 5 years, there's been a huge rise. You know, the sheer numbers of the people killed, you know, some people forget about these attacks, like the Nice truck attack, when a man drove a truck into a group of people celebrating Bastille Day, which I think killed 89 people. You know, the Bataclan massacre, where 100 people were killed watching a rock concert in Paris. The Manchester Arena bombing, of course, which killed 21 people. I mean, huge attacks. And it's really extraordinary the extent to which they've faded from consciousness in Britain in particular. You know, the Oasis song, Don't Look Back in Anger, that became the anthem after the Manchester Arena bombing. And it really summed up people's attitude to this form of extremism, which is, you know, don't look back, forget about it, move on. It was really brought home to me, in fact, when there was the Charlottesville attack in August 2017, when a crazy right-winger drove his car into a bunch of lefty protesters in Charlottesville, Virginia, and he killed one person. Really gruesome attack. Anyone who's seen the video footage will know how sickening it was. 5 days later, there was a car attack in Barcelona by a radical Islamist, which killed 10 people. And every single left-wing person I've spoken to over the past 3 years vividly remembers Charlottesville, and in fact has organized protests about Charlottesville and talks about it a lot and holds it up as proof that fascism has come back. None of them remember the Barcelona attack. None of them talk about the Barcelona attack, and certainly none of them have organized any form of protest against this form of fascism. So that double standard, I just find it mind-blowing, and it really calls into question the idea that these people are opposed to extremism at all. They're only opposed to certain forms of extremism, but there are other forms of extremism which they just would rather we didn't talk about.
Why do you think that is?
I think there's numerous reasons. I think partly it's down to the politics of identity, which is such a crude racial form of politics. And one of the things that the politics of identity says is that white people are privileged and brown people are oppressed. I mean, it's a very juvenile way of understanding the world. And therefore, the attack in Charlottesville makes sense to these people. You know, it's proof that white men are a problem and lots of them are extremists, and therefore we all have to denounce it. Whereas, the hundreds upon hundreds of people killed in Europe by largely brown Islamic radicals is something that makes them uncomfortable because it doesn't fit into their narrative. It doesn't work in their minds, and they prefer simply not to talk about it. Another reason is that they're very fearful of the public. So their response to radical Islamist attacks is always to worry that there will be an Islamophobic backlash. That's what the left in Europe always says. They say, listen, we can't talk about this too much. We can't focus on it too much, because if we do, there could be a backlash against Muslim communities. They might suffer revenge attacks and so on. And it's such a bizarre way of understanding things. Imagine if after the New Zealand massacre in the mosques in New Zealand, imagine if the left responded by saying, we shouldn't talk about this too much because people might attack white men, or white men might feel unsafe. That would be such a perverse response, and I think everyone would recognize that as a perverse response. And yet that's what they say in response to radical Islamist attacks. So I think the reason they ignore these things is because they have this kind of patrician desire to protect Muslim communities from any form of open debate or criticism, which I think is a kind of racial paternalism on the part of the left. And also, they fear ordinary people, and they fear that stupid, dumb, tabloid-reading masses might attack Muslims if there's an Islamic attack. So they just hush the whole thing down, suppress discussion, and they end up suppressing honest discussion about the problems in our society.
Yeah, I mean, you get the same kind of response if you criticize China, the Chinese government, which is that in criticizing China, you're going to contribute to racist attacks against Chinese people here in Vancouver, where I live. And it's like, oh, okay, so speaking freely and like independent thought and critical thought is now responsible for racist violence, and also it means that we can't criticize, really bad things that are happening in the world. This doesn't seem like a practical solution or a useful way to look at things.
Yeah, it's crazy. And the really shocking thing about the Samuel Paty murder, I mean, firstly, there was the murder itself, which was really grim. But the response over the past week or so since it happened has been for people to attack France. I mean, we've had Turkey and Pakistan have both denounced France and said that it effectively that it brought this on itself by allowing people to criticize Islam. Many Western intellectuals agree with that outlook, in fact. And after the Charlie Hebdo massacre, many novelists and columnists and other influential people said that, of course, no one should be shot, but Charlie Hebdo is a racist magazine. It's an Islamophobic magazine. It punches down. I remember when American Pen said that it was going to give a bravery award to Charlie Hebdo after the massacre. About 200 novelists, some of them very well-known novelists, wrote a letter of complaint saying we shouldn't give a bravery award to Charlie Hebdo because it punches down and its satire is racist. So for the past 5 years, it's been very clear that the intellectual elites of the West are not willing to defend freedom of speech. And even when people are murdered, they will find a way to make excuses for that, or to say, listen, if you don't want to be murdered, don't criticize Islam, which is such a yellow-bellied, cowardly, illiberal thing to say. It's the point George Orwell made many decades ago, which is that the real crisis of freedom is that the intellectual elites have abandoned it, and those are the people who are meant to uphold it, who are meant to believe in it, and who are meant to push it forward. But in our societies now, many of them don't believe in freedom, particularly freedom of speech, and that has a trickle-down effect on public life and political life. That's where I think the most important pushback has got to come, pushing back against the idea that censorship is acceptable and against cancel culture, which Donald Trump has done. Donald Trump is pretty much the only significant Western politician who has openly criticized cancel culture and said that this kind of silencing is unacceptable. I'd really like to see other Western politicians do something similar.
Mm-hmm. I mean, and it's interesting watching the conversation about social media censorship go down, and Trump has been one of the only ones to really be hammering on this topic and really trying to hold these corporations accountable for their political interference and their censorship and their lack of transparency. I mean, social media companies now have so much power, and are not accountable to anyone but themselves, and I suppose their shareholders. And, you know, it's the Democrats haven't criticized this at all. The left hasn't been critical of this at all. And it was amusing to watch the other day, you know, Jacobin, one of their videos, which is, you know, obviously like a socialist, or I guess, yeah, they would call themselves socialist website in the U.S. And they're up in arms because Facebook censored one of their videos, and everybody online is like, where have you been? Oh, that's right. You thought this wouldn't affect you, and it was fine when all of us are getting booted off social media, or when these like right-wing organizations or media outlets are when the New York Post is being censored.
Yeah.
Like, it's like
crazy. It's like, you know, these people really believe that they can support censorship of some groups and it won't come back to haunt them. They're so stupid. I mean, they really are dumb. But, you know, the thing is about, I think social media censorship is one of the worst forms of censorship today. And I'm just gobsmacked that the left would support this, because what that means is they are supporting capitalist elites who want to control public debate. That's what they're doing. They're supporting unaccountable corporations who have an almost monopolistic control over public discussion and political discussion on the internet. And they're supporting the right of these incredibly wealthy oligarchs to tell us what we can and cannot say. It's so unbelievably self-defeating that we have a left that supports capitalist censorship of ordinary people. And then the libertarian right isn't much better, because the libertarian right tends to have a very fetishized view of property rights. So they will say, listen, this is a private company. They can do whatever the hell they want. You know, shut up, don't complain, which is just not good enough in an era in which private companies have so much control over public discussion. That's a really weak response. So the libertarian right and the radical left are both completely screwing up when it comes to challenging social media censorship. And we do have to challenge it, because otherwise we're going to be in a world, as you know from personal experience and other people do as well, where you know, unaccountable corporations can determine your fitness for public life and can expel you from a significant part of the public realm if you hold views that they disapprove of, or if you are insufficiently woke, or if you grate against any kind of contemporary orthodoxy. I find it really bemusing that more people on the left can't see the dangers in that. And I'm just hoping at some point they will wake up and realize that calling on capitalism to censor public debate is a really stupid idea.
Yeah, I mean, it's tough because we know, I mean, I don't live in the US, so I don't have to vote, maybe luckily, but it's we've seen evidence that the Democrats are really tied to these social media corporations, to Facebook and Twitter, and that is to their benefit. And so the sort of I think this is a really big deal. I think it's really terrifying that these corporations have total control over discourse, what we're allowed to say, what we're not allowed to say, that they'll, censor or, shadow ban users and information that supports Republicans over Democrats, that, is that they view as pro-Trump, and that the only hope that we have in terms of addressing this is, I think, actually, if Trump wins.
Yeah.
If the Democrats win, they're not going to stop these companies from doing a thing that benefits them, and that they're now beholden to these people. They have people, people from these social media companies are working for Biden. Like, there's a major conflict of interest that they are not going to address.
Yeah, and I think I really agree, and I think the stakes in the American election are so unbelievably high, because what's actually happening is that the kind of technocratic elites, the social media giants, the cultural elites in America, they clearly see defeating Trump as a necessary first step towards them reestablishing their authority over society.
Yeah.
And that's what they want to do. They want to go back to the pre-2016 world in which they held sway and their political views were the only ones that mattered, and anyone who disagreed with them ran the risk of being cancelled, and in which schools and educational institutions and cultural institutions were increasingly molding themselves around this kind of politically correct worldview, this intolerant worldview. The problem with Trump, as they see it, is that he turned all that stuff on its head and he raised a question mark over this process. Brexit did the same thing in Europe. Brexit put a massive question mark over various things that were happening in Europe. And that's why certain sections of the establishment hate those two things more than anything else. So in the US, what's really happening is that this is a clash. Everyone's saying this is a high stakes election, but I don't think they understand quite how high the stakes are. Because if Biden wins, and I say this as someone who doesn't particularly want Trump to win, so I'm in an incredibly difficult position. But if Biden wins, it will embolden all the problematic, regressive forces that you and I have just been talking about. And not just in America, but around the world. Even when Jacinda Ardern won a landslide victory in New Zealand a couple of weeks ago, even though New Zealand is a relatively small country in terms of population and influence, that was emboldening to large sections of the establishment in Western Europe and in the US. If Biden wins, it's going to have a transformative impact. And I think it will embolden all those regressive forces, and it will weaken the democratic spirit that we've seen over the past few years, where ordinary people have said, listen, stop calling us deplorable, stop cancelling us, stop taking the mick out of our political and cultural values. Don't demean us, don't treat us like shit, take us seriously. That's essentially what people have been saying over the past 4 or 5 years in different ways, in imperfect ways many times, especially in the vote for Trump. That was an imperfect rebellion, of course. But I think that what will happen if Biden wins is that there will be a pushback against all those plebs. All those stupid idiots will be put back in their place, and the supposedly rightful authority of the expert classes and the cultural classes will be reestablished. And that worries me enormously. I'm not on the streets cheerleading for Trump by any stretch of the imagination, but I have this sneaky feeling that a Biden victory could be worse. And I could be proven wrong, but we'll see what happens.
Mm-hmm. I mean, do you have any election predictions?
I'm reluctant to make predictions because politics is so unpredictable. I mean, everything I read says that Trump can't win, and all the polls show that Biden has a huge victory. But there were similar polls in 2016 showing that Hillary Clinton had a big victory, and also very few polls in the UK predicted a Brexit victory. And we know because we've seen numerous polls over the past few years where if you look at different political groupings in society, social conservatives and right-wing people feel more compunction to censor themselves than liberals and left-wing people do. There's been quite interesting surveys in the US which have found that amongst Trump supporters and social conservatives and right-wingers, there's much more of an instinct to self-censorship because they know their views are unfashionable. They will be called racist, they will be called ignorant, etc. Whereas among liberals and radical leftists, there's very little self-censorship because they know their views are celebrated in the New York Times and on Saturday Night Live and everywhere else. So that makes me think that the polls could be wrong because very often people tell pollsters what they think pollsters want to hear. And if someone phones you up and says, are you voting Trump? You might well say no, because you don't want to be thought of as the kind of person who votes for Trump. So that could come into play. Shy Trump voters could be a force here, but it's really unpredictable. And the way I see it, it's either going to be a landslide for Joe Biden, which is what's being predicted, or it could be another electoral college victory for Trump. That's how unpredictable it is.
Yeah, for sure. It was really awesome to talk to you again. I really enjoy our conversations always, and I think that we should do it more, of course. But yeah, thanks so much for your time. I really appreciate it.
Thanks, Megan.
Okay, take care.
Cheers.
Bye.